Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, can everybody see my screen? Yep, all right. I'm gonna move you guys to the bottom, I think. That'll be easier. All right, so thank you for having me tonight. My name's Janelle Walkley. I am a program manager at Memorial Sloan Kettering, based in New York City. I'm actually not there right now. We've been remote since March, and the area that I'm in right now is more on the administrative side of things. So I've been fortunate to be remote this full time and, working daily from home. So I will go ahead and get started. So tonight, I'm going to go through, kind of my experience at HWS, um, what I did when I was on campus, and then also um, after I left school and graduated in May, like what I did for networking, applications, interviews, all of that. And then I'm going to give a pretty broad overview of clinical research, and I will focus in kind of on the structure at MSK, but there are a lot of other academic institutions similar to us. So what I share will be relatable if you happen to be interested in going to another major institution like Johns Hopkins or something like that. And then, as Brianna mentioned, you can ask questions along the way in the chat. If you do have a question, I'll try and pause in between slides as I'm going through the different agenda items. And then at the end, we can take any other questions that come to you, throughout the discussion. So I was a biochemistry major and a pre-health minor on campus. And originally when I started out school, I didn't know if I was like more interested in biology or chemistry. And I kind of realized along the way that I really liked both of them. And so I kind of settled on the biochemistry major just because, as I took my first year of courses, I, made a decision that I didn't really want to give up either. And I wanted to advance in both of them. And, for a long time, I found out or thought that I was going to end up like going to medical school. So I was kind of moving in that path where, I wasn't 100% sure what type of doctor I wanted to be, but I figured at some point I would, apply to med school and go down that path. And I'll kind of touch a little more about how I wound up here as opposed to going to medical school along the way. And, my time on campus, I did volunteer again, like partly geared towards my like application to med school. I volunteered in the Penyan ER. I worked or volunteered for an elementary school science program with Professor DeDennis. And I lifeguarded in the summers. I worked as a camp counselor and also had a couple of different work study jobs during my tenure. So some of them probably don't seem as relatable. I did do, I announced the lacrosse games back in the day, but I also like worked up in Winn-Sealy and helped with some administrative items there. And then I would say one of the biggest things that led me into this field was my summer research at HWS. So I did 2 years of summer research. My first year was with Professor DeDennis, and I had taken, she led one of my labs, and when I was in lab, she could tell that I really enjoyed it, and she had mentioned that, oh, there's a summer research program, you should consider applying to it. And at the time, I didn't know anybody else that was doing it. I really didn't know much about it other than, hey, take a look at this. So I proceeded to apply for it. I, got the position. And so I worked with her that first year. So that was my sophomore year. And after that year, I said, I am definitely doing this again. Like, this was great. And she proceeded to tell me that she was going on sabbatical that following summer. So she wasn't going to have a position that I could continue to work in. So after that, I ended up working in Professor Miller's lab. And what was cool about having experience in both labs, although I would have, loved to have continued to work on my original project, is that they were both doing very different types of benchtop research. So one was organometallic research in Professor Dennis's lab, but the other did involve some solid phase and solution phase syntheses, and it was more geared towards cancer research, or like the early phases of like what you would work on in the lab. And so as I finished, work in the summer and then my final year of school, I knew I really enjoyed research. I had spent, months of my time and loved what I was doing. So I kind of thought, I'll just apply to research jobs. Like, I'm not, set on going to med school just yet. And that was kind of, where I started looking from there. So some of the obvious places that you would think to apply to would be pharmaceutical companies. There's big names, Pfizer, Johnson and Johnson. And so, I kind of started in that direction. But then with some coaching, I, did seek out the services of career services. And, I had tailored my resume for these research positions. But then as we were meeting and updating my resume, one of the things that they suggested I do is just schedule calls with alumni that are in the research field and hear from them like what it is that they do. Like, the call is not necessarily to get you a job. The call is for you to figure out like what types of jobs are out there, because research is a big a big thing, and there's so many different things that you could do. So as I started talking to different people, what I was hearing was that, oh, you're going to need at least a master's if you want to do benchtop research for these major pharma companies. So our recommendation is probably you should pursue going to school. If you like want to, get a job right now and start working out in research, maybe you should consider clinical research, or maybe you should consider research at an academic institution as opposed to with a pharmaceutical company. So from there, I continued, my phone discussions, and along the way, I spoke with an alumni from HWS, and she had mentioned that, my background sounded similar to what hers was when she was graduating, and she had started out as a research study assistant. So she had recommended like I take a look at the applications and then just email her and let her know once I had applied. So I would say for every like 50 places that I applied to, I might hear back from one, to begin with. So it's like you have to cast a wide net along the way to start hearing back from companies. But then it seemed like something really picked up after like this particular call, because she had told me to look, she had told me to apply, and then she had asked me to follow back up with her after I had applied, and she said that she would check in on it. She'd actually had moved into like the annual giving and like philanthropy side of MSK. So she wasn't like directly connected to this anymore, but her being able to follow up internally, I think, is what really propelled my ability to like meet with someone from HR and then the additional interviews that followed. And in terms of interviewing for the job, so I probably had 5 interviews before, I was offered this position. I would say that's a little unusual now. Even when I look at the staff that I'm hiring for positions, we usually have 2 to 3 interviews is usually what it tops out at. And so one of the things that I would say to all of you is, regardless of what field you're going into, you want to make sure that you are learning as much about the position and the company that you are going to be interviewing with before you get in the room. Because the more you know, the more informed you are, the better like you can, position yourself when you're meeting with them. The other thing is, come with questions. No one is ever gonna complain if you come with questions, or if that you come with a notepad with a list of questions. If anything, I am so happy to see that. And even doing these interviews via video, which I've hired quite a few staff now through Zoom or MSK or Microsoft Teams, I'm fine with people asking questions and saying, oh, I have a few notes down here, let me take a look at them. The other thing is, because this will be many of your, first jobs, like in the real world that you're going to do for a while, you really need to think about what are your transferable skills. And one example I'll give of that is I had a new hire that had, was interviewing for a research study assistant position, and she had lifeguarded for a long time, and she was a head lifeguard at her particular location. And so she explained in the interview, when we were asking different situational questions, that she would, she felt she could manage the patient scheduling and the patient appointments, and making sure that everything stayed according to schedule, because she was used to doing this for all of her staff. She had, 16 to 21-year-old staff that she was assigning, different work schedules to them throughout the week and throughout the summer. And some of them weren't as reliable as others. So she had to make adjustments and update the schedule. So, that's, one example. But I think, like, when you look back at what you've done, or, what you're doing right now, you'll be able to think about, like, what are those things that I can speak to in an interview? Like, you may not have ever done clinical research, but there are certain parts in clinical research that you can describe, like how you've done something that transfers into this. Any questions so far, Brianna?
Not yet.
Oh, okay, I'm just double checking.
Perfect.
So moving on. So what is clinical research? And you know, I think right now, because of COVID and all of the media surrounding development of a vaccine, probably all are very aware of what clinical research is. But so to summarize, it's research that involves particular person or group of people that uses materials for humans, such as their behavior or samples of their tissue. And clinical research, big picture, helps us find new and better ways to detect, diagnose, treat, and prevent disease. Clinical trials are a type of research study that tests how well new treatments and devices work in people. Clinical trials that test new methods of screening, prevention, diagnosis, or treatment of disease use a protocol. So when in the clinical research world, our protocol is, the said document that covers all of the rules of what needs to happen with the clinical trial. And so we are constantly referring back to that document, and that will make, decisions on what should be done if, a patient is experiencing a symptom that they shouldn't. Do they need to come off study? Do they pause on treatment? So all of that is outlined in the protocol, along with a lot of other guidance in terms of how we would analyze the data. If there is randomization involved, it would outline how that randomization happens. So it is the main document that we are constantly referring to. When you think of clinical trials, so the first thing that someone will ask you, who is sponsoring that clinical trial? And the things that are most common are industry sponsored studies, which involve pharmaceutical companies. However, there are clinical trials that are sponsored by institutions. So the area that I work in right now, my team only oversees trials that are sponsored by MSK. So we are the sponsor of them. We are responsible for the oversight, quality assurance, the conduct of the study at MSK and all of the centers that are participating on it. There's also clinical research organizations that exist that can be hired to oversee certain aspects. So sometimes a pharmaceutical company will hire a CRO to take over a lot of the administrative tasks that are required for a study. And so up on this screen, here's just some of the things that they may be involved in terms of the oversight of the trial. So they could help design the study. They could be involved in patient recruitment. They could be, doing the site activation, or they could be doing the data cleaning. They may be looking at the data that's been entered for each of the subjects that are on the clinical trial and kind of questioning if there are issues that were identified with the data. If there's holes that are missing, they may say, I see that, patient 5 um, mentions that they have high blood pressure and there are no medications that they're taking for this. Are they really not taking anything for their high blood pressure? Or did the site coordinator forget to enter their blood pressure medication? So there's things like that in terms of the data cleaning that will happen throughout the lifetime of the study. So the types of trials, so this is pretty common. The different phases are, 0 to 4. MSK really does, anything from phase 1. There are a few preclinical, but I would say the majority of the trials that I've been involved with are anything from phase 1 to phase 3. And what's been really cool about my experience is that I spent the first portion of my career in lymphoma. And there's, from 2010 until now, there's been a number of drugs that have been approved for different indications for lymphoma treatment. And so, throughout my time, this has happened like as I was part of it. So there were trials that I worked on that were FDA inspected. The inspection went well. The data, checked out for what they saw in terms of the results, and it led to a drug approval. So that's definitely been like a rewarding experience, to see over time. I worked on a study for a little bit. I have since moved to different positions at the institution, and then I'll see, oh wow, that was a drug I worked on and now it's approved for something else. So the longer that you stay in research, the more things that come up that you're like, I did work on that for a little bit. Opdivo, like I have worked with that drug many of times. And so I would say that is something that, you don't really know what you're going to get assigned to, but at any time that you are assigned a trial, it really matters that you are, accurate and on point with what you're doing, because there is a chance that it could get checked for approval. There is a chance that someone may want to come back and look at that data. So, when we are training our coordinators, we're telling them, you don't know what's going to happen with this trial. So at any point, like everything that you do will have a potential impact down the road. And so if there are issues with it, if you're unsure of what to do, speak up, ask questions. So clinical research at MSK. So the clinical research administration is broken up, and I'm mostly going to focus on these first 2 boxes. So there's clinical research compliance and there's clinical research operations. So a lot of what I just talked about before falls under that clinical research operations box. But to just quickly go through clinical research compliance, there are going to be monitors for your studies. There could be auditors that come in for your studies. You could be one of, fill one of those roles. I have a number of staff that report into my team right now that are involved in the monitoring and auditing, and my team actually falls under this clinical research compliance box. In addition, there's other departments that fall under there outside of like my multi-center team. And one of them is our investigational new drug program, and it also involves devices. So we will submit our own investigational new drug request to the FDA, or we will cross-file with one that may already exist. So an example of that, there's a drug called brentuximab vedotin, and it's produced by Seattle Genetics. We may ask Seattle Genetics to use their drug in a clinical trial, which they would if they agreed and approved us to do so, we would submit a cross-reference if it wasn't approved for the indication or the type of cancer treatment for the patients that they were planning to treat on the trial. So that office like oversees and performs all of the communications with the FDA. We also have a human research protection program, and that team answers a lot of these inquiries that come up. Maybe there's a patient issue that that happened, or there's a safety issue, and they get looped in to oversee how that should be handled in terms of like what needs to be done in the patient's best interest or what should be done ethically. And so they would be involved in that, and they would oversee that until resolution. We also have a team that is fully dedicated to submitting protocols. So protocol development could be anything from opening a study that an investigator, a principal investigator at MSK wrote themselves, to submitting a study where it's industry run trial that they send you an entire protocol and an approved document and say, please submit this. We want you to be part of the study. So it kind of varies in the types of trials that they're submitting and activating at MSK, but it's just dependent upon what gets assigned to them. And then there's our data and safety monitoring plans. So for the entire institution, we have plans for how our data and safety is handled as an institution, but then how it narrows down into a protocol itself. And then with the clinical research operations, this is where I would say like there's more potential for more interaction with patients, more hands-on interaction at like the day-to-day level of what's happening with the clinical trial. So there, as the protocol is open and there are patients on, there are staff in this that are overseeing, making sure that the visits are scheduled, confirming that if there are research bloods or tumor biopsies that need to happen, making sure that all of those happen, and then following them through to where they need to go. They may need to be shipped out to an external laboratory, or they may need to be processed internally at one of our MSK research labs. And in addition to all of this, there's patient and staff education programs that are involved with the operations, but then there's facilities and then business and disaster recovery. So there's a lot of different teams that link into this that may not be just exactly involved in the protocol itself. I won't touch as much about the three on the right, but I will make a note that we have dedicated clinical trial nurses. And so this is something that you're seeing that in the clinical research world, we're seeing more and more, but all of the research nurses have their nursing degree, but then they are, assigned to work in research. So it's not just that they randomly get research patients, they are specifically dedicated to these protocols. And we have a finance team that's involved in building the budgets, recovering the money, and then anything in between that may come up with that. And then of course there's a contracting team that handles all of our clinical trial agreements, any of the data use agreements, any of the agreements that may come up depending on the type of research. All right, so types of clinical research. So we have prospective and retrospective, and it's pretty straightforward. For the prospective research, it can be therapeutic or non-therapeutic, and it can be interventional or observational. It really just depends on like what the protocol is looking at. So my team is working solely on prospective research, but there's a ton of retrospective research across the institution and across the departments. So every department across the institution is doing research. So it doesn't matter if you're in surgery or if you're in neurology or you're in gastro, it doesn't matter. There's research happening all across. For retrospective research, so some of the times we'll see these large data sets that they'll want to combine from a number of institutions, and they'll go back and look at treatments that had happened to see what side effects or any, any additional issues that may, be informative for a future clinical trial. And so types of clinical trials, I had this on the last slide, but there's therapeutic and non-therapeutic. So the obvious ones for therapeutic are your drug trials, but there's also devices out there. So when you think of surgery, there's pumps that are being placed, there's catheters that are being used, and there's so many different companies that are building these devices. And so, every individual piece has its own approval process. So you may say that this seems pretty easy. Like, I know that, so-and-so in my family had a catheter. Well, it may not be the same exact make and model of the catheter being used, and this one may be better for another reason. And so, there are device trials. There's prevention therapy. There could be HIV therapy to prevent transmission, radiation therapy, surgery used as therapeutic intent. For non-therapeutic studies, we have diagnostic studies that are looking to see if there's a test that can be done to indicate whether, someone would be at greater risk to get a type of cancer. There's prevention, like non-therapeutic studies that are educational, educating that smoking is, you're at greater risk to get lung cancer. And so some of these are, I guess, maybe simpler examples, but you can apply it to bigger concepts. There's also a lot of quality of life or quality improvement. And sometimes our therapeutic studies will add in a non-therapeutic component. So you will see that, they're on a clinical trial, they're getting a treatment. They may also have to fill out questionnaires every month that they come in for clinic. And so it'll be duly assessed throughout the lifetime of the study. Oops, sorry about that. So to go through the types of positions there are, and I do want to point out that this is specific to MSK, but some of these titles are the same at other institutions. And even if they're a little different, I had mentioned before research study assistant. So when I first started, I am dating myself now. The title, the position that I was hired into was a research study assistant. They now have titles of clinical research coordinator. And so below the boxes, you'll see, really what that type of role is specific to. So this clinical research coordinator position at MSK is specific to data management. So that's everything from collecting the data to transcribing that information into the database. I actually have not had any paper CRF studies at all during my career at MSK. And so, not that they will never exist, but I would say it's unlikely. But there are some sites that still use paper case report forms. And so, it's uncommon now, but for the most part, you'll take a look at the patient's medical record, and they'll want to know the lab results from their CBC. And you would transcribe that information, the date, the time of the sample, and then what the actual lab values are. So that stuff will all get transcribed. Some of the data can be more involved. So if a patient is on a treatment and they're coming up to a response time point, there may be a scan involved. And then after that scan happens, the scan needs to get read in a very specific way according to the response criteria in the protocol. So you may have to schedule time with the dedicated radiologist to get the read of the scan so that you can enter that information in. So it's not, some of the data points are very easy to pull from the database, and some of the others are more involved. And then, once the study is up and running and it starts getting monitored, your monitor may start querying the data and asking questions based on when they're looking at the source versus what you entered, and asking you to confirm things. So there's, the the straightforward data entry piece, but then there's also query resolution, that you go through and you have to respond to and address. There's also clinic management. So I talked about how when the patients come in, how do they know what they have to do? How do you make sure everything's ordered? There's clinic staff that are dedicated to that research team. And so they will be overseeing everything from start to finish for each day of clinic. And that role, they're exposed to all of the clinical trials. They're not just dedicated to like, I only have 5 protocols because these are my protocols. They're more of like a central team member that helps all of the protocols. Whereas the data management, you may only be assigned a set number of protocols based on how complex the database is, how quickly the study enrolled. If your child is a phase 1 study and you enroll 20 patients, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of data points that you would be entering. So you may not have more than one clinical trial. You may just be working directly on that. There's also a huge area of research is the regulatory aspect. So there's this position called the Research Regulatory Associate that's dedicated to handling all of those. So if the protocol is amended at any time, there's a full submission process that needs to be followed. And then maybe you have to reconsent your patients. And so ensuring that the study team and the PIs and the investigators know about that would be handled by that regulatory management. And then there are some roles that are project focused. So these are a little more challenging for me to say exactly what the project would be, but sometimes there's a doctor that will receive a grant for a specific project that maybe isn't necessarily a clinical trial that we're going to enroll prospectively, but maybe it's a retrospective project, and they're going to need someone to kind of mine the data, but then also coordinate calls with sites. And so, these roles are a little different because they're more project focused and maybe just tied to a type of grant that was received. Beyond this, so I've stayed at MSK. So I did start out, kind of in this clinical research coordinator position, and I worked in clinic, I've worked in the regulatory side, and then I moved into the supervisor type role. And from there, and within all of that, I had started out in the lymphoma team. And then I moved up to the clinical research manager position within that team. So after that, I have since transitioned to a program manager role, and I'm now in our multi-center program. So, what I've described so far is just generally about research, but in the program that I'm in now, and the program that I oversee, it's all investigator-initiated trials that we are sponsoring, but we are also opening at other locations. So we have sites in Israel, we have sites in Canada, but then we have, a lot more common sites that we work with all the time. We work with Dana-Farber, UCLA, CHLA. So depending on the trial and depending on the department and service, if it meets those like baseline criteria to be multi-center sponsored by us, then my team would oversee that type of work. So to dive back into some more about the different aspects. So, one thing, if you are interested in research, I think honing in on like, what direction do you want to go in terms of a career? Are you more interested in starting out in the data entry and query resolution so that you get familiar with the schedules of the clinical trials and making sure that everything's available so that when the trial is finished, all of that is what is going to lead to that publication that potentially could be submitted for FDA approval if that's the direction that the study's going in. But even for studies that don't go for FDA approval, the publication at the end of the study is just as valuable. It may be that you publish that something was a negative study. That will inform the rest of the researchers that are honing in on that type of research. Oh, we shouldn't keep pursuing this avenue of research. It's a negative direction. We should move forward with this other pathway. So all of that, is the beginning stages, but also is really, at the end of the day, that's what's going to make the decision with the study is like the data will make the decision once that's published. The monitoring and auditing, you may find that, you know, you like overseeing the research, but you don't necessarily want to be the one doing all of the hands-on work, but you're more interested in QAing the work. You're very meticulous, you're interested in seeing what's going on and making sure that you can make sense of everything from the data side. Or you may be interested in regulatory. So the regulatory spans a number of things. It could be anything from working with investigators to write and submit the protocols to actually maintaining the regulatory while the study is up and running. So there's so many different regulations that we are held accountable to when performing clinical research. And so, once the study is up and running, you have to have medical license for all of the practicing investigators on the study. You have to have their CVs. But then you also need to make sure that you have all of the documentation that's ever been submitted to your institutional review board. And that needs to be filed in the reg binder. And then last but not least, the patient management. So there is dedicated staff that are overseeing what's happening with the patient and planning accordingly if the patient calls and says, I'm not coming in, I'm not feeling well today, or I missed my dose, what should I do next? So all of that type of stuff, even though you may not make like the clinical decision, you're the one who's making sure that you find the doctor to get the answer for them or getting in touch with the nurse for that type of stuff. And that's all for tonight. So I will take any questions you have.
Awesome. Thank you, Janelle. I have a question if nobody else does yet. And if you do, feel free to unmute yourself and chime in. But one question that I had as you were talking, I know that you mentioned that you aren't necessarily assigned to your research, right? Like as you're applying. So when you're applying for the clinical research coordinator, kind of just entry level position, at what point are you told the type of research that you're doing, or are you able to kind of give a preference? How does that work?
Yeah, so I think the posting for the clinical research coordinator, for most of them, it's a more general posting. But once you start, HR may not be the best person to ask, but when you have that first round of interviews, that's a great question to ask. You can investigate, you'll know what department you're meeting with. So I'll give an example. I know if there's an opening in myeloma, um, I would take a look at their website. I would look at, the myeloma website, and I would look to see what types of clinical trials is the myeloma team doing, and kind of come prepared. Do you know what type of trial I would be working on the data entry for, or, performing query resolution for, and kind of coming with that question if it's not brought up specifically in the interview, because they may say, this is what the position is, kind of to give an overview of what the position is when you first start out the interview. But they may not. They may say, the clinical research coordinator, these are the responsibilities that this position has, and then they may move on. So I would say it's unlikely that it would be posted, but it's definitely one that they will be able to answer in the interview.
Awesome. Anyone else yet so far? Because I have a couple written down, so I can keep going. But if not, you guys can feel free to jump in and let me know. Anybody? Okay. I know you had mentioned kind of graduate school, and obviously you chose not to go on to medical school. So do you find that if you want to move up in terms of kind of the hands-on research and staying within the clinical research rather than more of like the program management that you've moved into and the regulatory work, do you find that people do end up going to graduate school for research specific opportunities, or are you able to kind of move up within that sphere without needing graduate school?
It's a combination of both. I mean, I don't think really you 100% need it. It's not like they're going to just immediately strike you off if you don't have it, because at the end of the day there's usually like, if you have this, educational experience and this number of years of service, you're eligible for the job.
Mhm.
Um but it's a combination of both. So I have, other colleagues that they've gotten their MPH and they've remained in research. But then there's also other staff like myself that started out in this and kind of worked our way up with experience. I do have um, certifications that I've completed that are research related, but they're not, a full graduate school program. But it's definitely a field where you can choose kind of your preference. Um, One thing that I'll just say is that when you are applying to jobs and you are looking at like what they're offering, look to see, not many places now give you funding to go back to school. And so one thing that MSK has is a tuition reimbursement program, and it has to be um, a degree that is relatable back to work that you're doing here. So I have had staff that were ultimately interested in nursing. One of them actually, she just came back, so she left. Um, she started out taking courses, was getting tuition reimbursement because she was in nursing school. Then she left and started her like first full-time nursing job, and she's actually now coming back as a clinical trials nurse. So there is a good amount of that too, where like people take advantage of um, the tuition reimbursement. And right now there's not a service requirement for you that you have to work 5 years here to, or have to stay after you get your degree. So it is something to look for when you are applying to jobs.
Awesome. Any other questions that you guys might have? Feel free to unmute. All right. Well, Janelle, if students do come up with questions, or if they're interested in kind of speaking further, if they plan to apply down the road, is it okay for them to reach out to you and contact you
Absolutely.
further?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. And I feel like it's hard to digest someone speaking to you for 30 minutes and then, know all of your questions. So feel free to give them my email. I'm happy to, if you have other questions and you would rather just speak with me, I'm happy to schedule time to speak with any of you. So please don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Perfect. So if you guys have questions or want to get in touch, please feel free to email me, and I would be happy to share Janelle's contact information with you guys. But otherwise, thank you so much for taking the time out tonight to share this information with students, let them know what this world looks like. It's been super helpful for me too. So I appreciate your time, and thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.